Hello and welcome back to my shop. My name is George and I'm coming to you from Chelsea, Quebec. Now this is a sort of a part 2 to the video that I just published on making a router-mortiser that self-centers. If you recall from that video, we talked about a problem of having a tedious setup, not just for the first mortise that you want to make, but for the remaining 7 as well. And what I decided to do was make it a little fancier by creating some stop blocks, so the first setup is still tedious, but the remaining 7 are quicker to make. So let me show you the stop blocks and how they work, and yeah, let's get going. So I'll go through the process of setting up the first piece. I happen to have a piece of scrap that's about the size of the short aprons that I'm going to be using, so I'll use this. So it starts off setting the edge of the apron on the thickness of a playing card so that it ends up being just slightly below grade. Now here are the pieces that I prepared that can accept the blocks, the stop blocks. I prepared 2, but the second one is really a backup. You really need to prepare only 1. You will need a blank that's the same thickness, but it doesn't have to be bored quite the same way. So here's the inner stop, and I'll just bring it up and stop the piece against it, and I'll bring in its mate roughly the same level. And now we need a couple of glides. So I have these 2. I've selected the 1/2 inch glides because the distance between my pins is 3.5 inches, and when I build this up I come in at just shy of 3 inches. If I had used the 3/4 inch blocks, then this would have been wide and it would risk binding a little bit on the pins. So you want to make sure that the width that you build up gives you some clearance to the 2 pins. So now we're ready to clamp. Give it a final look and see that everything looks pretty good. Now I'll point out that I've already marked a couple of lines here, 1/2 inch from the edges. So we'll slip it into the vise. And check the travel on it just to make sure that we've got a smooth glide. Okay, that's nice. So for my router base, the distance from the outer edge to the center is about 3.25 inches. So with my line over here, I'm going to need the stop to be about 3.25 inches away, and that puts me right up against this hole, and this hole is 1 inch away from that hole. So that tells me that the stop block should be screwed into this hole, and it should run down about 1 inch from that end. So that limits the number of different stop blocks that I need to try to figure out where the best position is. So here are 3 blocks where the hole that I'm going to use for mounting, it's the middle one here, the lower one here, and the end one here. Those holes are more or less lined up with each other. And these 3 have lengths that are in the 1 inch vicinity. So the white block in the middle has a length of 1 inch from the center of the mounting hole to the end. This one is 15/16 and this one is 1 1/16. And it turns out that the white block is the one that suits us best. So I'll just make sure the video is a little bit shorter by not taking you through this trial and error process. We'll just slip this one into place. So it'll go in there, mounted like this. Now in the trial and error business, I had the router in place and just eyeballed different blocks to see which one was best. So we'll just slip this one in. And bring the router into position. Run it up to the stop block. And it looks like I've gone too far. So I'm going to reverse the position of this block and put the long end in, I think. Yeah, that's just perfect. So I'll just thread that in. So now we'll do the same thing for the other end. I'll bring the router back and I'll be sighting the position of the bit against the line that I've drawn on the workpiece. And it looks like I need maybe 1 inch and a bit more than 1/2, or maybe something in the vicinity of 1/2 inch from this hole. So I'll try a few blocks until I find the right one. So this red block looks pretty good. Looking at its through hole, lining it up against a mounting hole, and then seeing how it addresses the router. This is now with the router bit sitting right at the end of the line here. This one looks pretty good, so I'll try this one, and I think I'll also try one that's 1/16 of an inch shorter. So here's the red block now threaded into place, and when I look at the bit relative to the line, it looks like I'm shy by almost 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to pull the red block and put in the other block, which is 1/16 of an inch shorter, which will bring the router back to the line. So I threaded in a block that was 1/16 of an inch shorter than the red one that I tried, which is going to bring the router back by 1/16 of an inch. And when I check it, looking at the bit against the line that I drew on the workpiece, it ends up being perfect. Now it's just a coincidence that it happens to be the two white blocks that work in this case. It could quite easily have been a combination of different colors. So with the blocks set up for the first piece, you can go ahead and route it, and then without removing the blocks, set the position for the remaining workpieces, and things will go a lot quicker. So in the main video I told you about the glides that I had created. So basically MDF, so dimensionally accurate cleats. In this case I've got my 1/2 inch ones over here, along with a melamine sliding surface that moves smoothly. Now for the stop system, I needed to make another couple of cleats. So I took some maple and I milled it to 1/2 inch. The reason for using maple is because I needed to tap some holes, and MDF is just no good for that. So some fine-grained wood like walnut or maple readily taps. And I just used a regular 1024 tap. So I've got a couple of holes bored at one end for the farthest point forward that the router is going to go. And then there's space allotted for the router plate, for the base plate. And then a whole series of holes. They're at exactly 1 inch intervals for places to put the stops. And the stops that I made are 3D printed. Oh, let me mention one more thing about this. I have a groove running down the length of this piece, and also I've got places where I can thread in an inner stop. So this inner stop lets you position the workpiece where you need it along the way. So I prepared 2 of these, working on the odds that maybe one of them wouldn't turn out, and so I'd have a second one. But after I finished the first one, it worked out well, and so I didn't bother finishing the second one. Then I have a whole bunch of 3D printed blocks. Now let me say right here, before going too far, you don't need to 3D print the blocks. They could quite readily be made out of wood. It was more fun for me to put my 3D printer to work. So here are some details about the stops themselves. As you can see, there's an assortment here. The 2 red ones are identical to each other, so same for the 2 green, the 2 blue, etc. The colored ones have 3 holes each. They are through holes, and they allow the passage of a 1024 bolt, which is the right size. The holes that were bored in the cleats were tapped at 1024. The 3 holes are exactly 1/2 inch apart. And let me just focus here on the red ones. They're the ones that I made first. So again, 3 holes exactly 1/2 inch apart. Now from the hole at one end to the end of the block is 1/8 of an inch. At the other end, I added a 1/16. So from the center of the hole to the block's end is 3/16 of an inch. So back to the short side, we're 1/8 of an inch away. That means 5/8 of an inch from the center hole and 1 1/8 inches from the far hole. Now if you turn it around, you have that same relationship, but now with 3/16 of an inch as the starting point. So 3/16 to the first hole, 11/16 to the middle hole, and 1 inch and 3/16 to the far hole. So out of this one block, depending on which of the holes I've chosen and whether the block is oriented this way or this way, I get 6 different distances to choose from. And I did the same thing with the green block, except the green block, if you line up the 3 through holes, is 1/8 of an inch longer on each side. So if with this one I have 1/8 and 3/16, then on this one I'm going to have 1/4 inch and 5/16. And the same thing goes for the blue block. After I made those, I took inventory of what distances I had, and it turned out that I was missing exactly 1 inch and exactly 1/2 inch. So I made these this 4th pair where I have exactly 1/2 inch from the near hole. Here it's 1/2 inch plus 1/16, and then of course I have exactly 1 inch and 1 inch and 1/16 with that one. So depending on which block I choose and its orientation and which of its through holes I've chosen, I get all kinds of distances covered at 1/16 of an inch steps. So the distances go from 0 through to I think it's 1 inch and 9/16. Now that's just for one place along the cleat. In addition to that, I have a whole range of distances by the holes that are drilled at 1 inch intervals all along the cleat. So that's how these guys work. So imagine now that the first workpiece has been set up and the mortise has been routed. We're going to keep our stop blocks in exactly the same place. And because we've got the stop blocks here on the upper surface and we still want to build from the top, using the top as a reference, we need to use these 2 blocks to clear the stop blocks. These are exactly the same thickness. They're cut-offs from our workpieces after they were properly thicknessed. So here's a second workpiece, and we'll set it down on the playing card and then just justify it up against the stop, the inner stop, and we'll bring the mating piece along with a couple of smooth glides. We'll give a little bit of tension to the clamp, make sure everything is on register, and then bring it home. So we didn't save any time in setting the clamps in place. But we no longer need to figure out how much travel we need from the router. We can just bring the router in place. And the stops are exactly where they need to be. So yeah, there's a time savings, but I think even more important than that is the tedium of constantly having to reference against drawn lines. That tedium has been removed. So you can go ahead now and just whip through mortise number 2 through to mortise number 8. So listen, thank you for sticking it all the way through to this end. I know this video had a lot of details in it. Don't forget that the 3D printed objects that I showed you could quite readily be made out of wood, so there's no need to rush out and buy a 3D printer. And the other thing I thought I should mention is as I was working through what I had done and how I was going to show it to you, it occurred to me that it might be even faster and simpler and more analog. In other words, you wouldn't be stuck with 1/16 of an inch steps. If you were to take a couple of popsicle sticks, turn them into wedges, and sandwich them into that groove that you made in that 1/2 inch plank of maple. So that's an alternative that you should consider for your own shop. Anyhow, again, thank you for sticking it all the way through to this point. And remember, make a little bit of time for your passion and share it.